So I'm really pleased that Ahmar Mahboob decided to join us for this webinar, and I'm really looking forward to what you've got to say about language variations and non-native speaker. And just to very briefly introduce the speaker, he teaches at the Department of Linguistics at the University of Sydney. He's received many awards and recognitions for his teaching and research. And he's a fellow of the National Talent Pool, president of Program for Highly Qualified Overseas Pakistanis, and Government of Pakistan. Ahmar is the founder of the Free Linguistics Conference, and he has served and serves on the editorial board of numerous journals. So Ahmar, we're all ears, and I'm really excited about this webinar and looking forward to what you've got to say.
Thanks, Marek. Thanks for the invitation. Can we have the PowerPoint here? Perfect. All right, good. So while that PowerPoint is loading, let me just again thank you, Marek, for inviting me to do this. Thank you, Manan and Mia Jun. I know that this is an odd time on a Sunday, wherever you might be in the world. Sundays are always a difficult day. And I know that this time, I mean, I know that at least in Asia, it's sort of early evening on a Sunday. So it's also a tricky time. So I'm hoping that other people will be able to listen to this recording at some point, and then we can continue this conversation. Manan and Mia Jun, and I guess anybody else who joins us, if you have questions, please, you can raise your hand, or you can type your question, or Marek, or you too. If anybody has a question, just type it on the chat box, and I will respond to it. Now, the topic today is a discussion on language variation and NNESTs. So I'm hoping that it will be a discussion, which I know it's a bit harder when it's not everybody has access to a mic. But you do, of course, do put in your questions. And Marek, if you have something that you want to add, feel free to jump in as well. Okay, so the way we are going to do this is, here's the outline. I'll briefly talk about what language is, then we'll briefly talk about what grammar is, because both of these are really important questions and concepts to have sort of a shared understanding about. And then once we've done this, I'll share my model of language variation with you. And after that, I'm going to discuss a list of observations, which will really, I hope, generate more discussion as well. So without further ado, moving on to what is language. So language, as many people think of language as a form of communication, which or language as a means of communication, which of course it is. Language is used for communication. It is used for communication, by all of us. But defining language as communication perhaps short sells it. And it is much more useful to think of language as a semogenic system. That is a system that creates meaning. So if you think of a language as a semogenic system, it means that it serves as a fundamental resource with which we build and negotiate relationships, shape experience, and deal with the many issues and challenges of life. It's something that is very intrinsic to us and to everything that we do as human beings. Without language, we wouldn't be able to do most of the things that we do in our everyday life, or do in our world around us. So even, for example, building technology, we can't create technology if we're not able to use language to construe and represent and engage with knowledge and meanings in very complex ways. So language then construes and represents meaning. As such, language creates our realities and allows us to share and negotiate them with others. And of course, these are done both in the local setting, in our everyday sort of contexts, and in specialized settings and with people that we don't know really well. So language allows us to create all these different kinds of meanings with a lot of different sorts of people anywhere in the world, or perhaps even beyond the world. So language has a huge potential, and that potential is realized through the utterances, and that we use or through the text that we write or speak. And this language is something that develops slowly over time. It's not something that we are born with, right? So it's something that we develop through our community, in our communities, and as we grow older, we interact with other people, we do other things with language, our language develops and evolves accordingly. So we learn how to use language with new people, with different people, from different types of people, and we learn how to use language in different contexts in doing and do different sorts of things. So language in that sense is not finite in any set of way, but it's infinite in the sense that it can be used in so many different ways. But in order to do that, we use it systematically, and it's not simply saying that we can put any random order of words and call it and be able to communicate across each other, but rather in many ways when we communicate with each other, the way we have a shared sense of doing things, and that sharing in many ways is perhaps more restricted and more constrained, because if it was a free for all, then we wouldn't be able to do it. So there are certain patterns and certain ways in which we do things, and those patterns allow us to share ways of doing things and to be able to communicate meaningfully in what we do. And that's really important to sort of start off with, because it leads into another question, which is a term that we all use all the time, especially as language teachers. But often when we are asked what we mean by the term, we are not very sure. And the term here, of course, is grammar. So we all use the term grammar. We talk about teaching grammar. We talk about learning grammar. And when we talk about this, we think about grammar in a quite a restrictive sense, and we think of it in terms of pedagogical grammar or descriptive grammar, and think of it in terms of different models of grammar. But yeah, those are ways of thinking of grammar, but we can think of grammar in another way as well. And the way I like to think about it is like to think about grammar as a theory of language. That is, it's a way in which we describe, explain, and organize our understandings about language. So language is something, grammar is a theory of language. It's grammar is, if it's a theory of language, it means that it both explains and it predicts how language works. So a good grammar, you're not going to be bogged in notion of prescriptive or descriptive grammar, but rather a grammar as a theory of language. A good theory of language would be able to predict things, not just describe them. So what it means is that if we think of grammar as a set of rules, then those rules should predict every occurrence of language. But we know that when we look at the actual occurrence of language and language samples, even with mother tongue speakers of a language, we find huge amounts of variation. Not everybody follows the same rules. So, right, so for example, double negatives, certain communities of monolingual speakers of English use double negatives, others do not. If the rules of a grammar are written, as I'm using the term rule here, if the rules say that you cannot have double negatives, then the prediction should be that nobody would use double negatives anywhere in the world. But that's not the case. People do use double negatives in many parts of the world. So here we have a situation where the rule tells us that you shouldn't have something, and yet the natural data tells us that it does exist. So we can do two things here, right? So we can, on the one hand, we can say, well, whatever exists as natural data is wrong, and it is the rule that's correct. And if the rule is not being followed, then everybody needs to be corrected, because everybody who's using language is wrong. And the rule, it tells us do this, and if you're not doing it, you're wrong. Therefore, you should be penalized, and you should be made to do what we tell you to do. Now, that's one way of looking at it, but I think that's a bit bizarre way of looking at language as a natural phenomenon, as a semogenetic system, and it's a bizarre way of thinking of grammar. So thinking of grammar as rules is bizarre, because these rules don't predict. They fail to predict a language use, and it is not the data or the naturally occurring language that is incorrect or used wrongly by people, but rather it is actually some of those rules, what we think of rules that are problematic, and perhaps it is the way that we use oh, sorry, I just saw that I was breaking up a little bit. Okay, I'm glad I'm back. Okay, so rather it's the rules that are problematic, not the language. And so if you think of grammar not in terms of descriptive or prescriptive or rules, but rather in a way of think of, okay, can we explain and describe the language that is used in a way that is both can explain how the variations exist, how people use it, but also it can predict where things will happen and how things will happen, right? And I think if you take that kind of an approach to language and to grammar, then it's much more meaningful. And as teachers, and not just as in teachers, but in a lot of different contexts and disciplines, a more, I guess, functionally oriented, a more theoretically oriented and I guess theoretically sound way of looking at grammar and language would be much more useful, because it becomes something that people can actually take and use, because it's predictable, right? Imagine this. Imagine if every time you turn on your power switch, you would only be able to guess if it will, if the electricity will turn on or not. If you turn on the switch, light doesn't go on. You turn on the switch, it goes on. Light, turn it on, it doesn't go on, and you keep going on like this. You will start getting really, uh, you will start thinking that it's really useless, and there's no point having this kind of technology when you can't predict anything, you can't use it reliably, and you will stop using it. Unfortunately for us, that's what has happened with linguists and linguistics and grammarians, and to a certain degree how we've used that work in education, that our work it doesn't lend itself to becoming predictive, to be predictable. So we cannot, based on our work on language, say here are some predictable ways of doing things, and if you apply then these predictions will work for you, and you will be able to use them efficiently and effectively. And because you can't do that, it loses its currency, it loses its um, uh, usability to a degree, and that's a problem. So these are some of the problems that we come into the discipline with, and these of course also have huge implications for NNESTs and NNESTs. So for example, when we think of grammar as being rule-based, and we find NNESTs who do not follow certain rules, then we start identifying them as incorrect users of language, or people who use bad language. And therefore, I suggest that they are not good teachers, because they can't use language properly. And again, the problem lies with how we see language and how we see grammar. And if we shift those understandings of language and grammar, then we can empower the teachers and empower NNEST. And so there's a very direct relationship between how we see language and grammar and the empowerment of the non-native speaking teachers. Now, that's all of as a background to what I really want to go into, which is looking at the language variation and looking at how we can understand language variation. Now, if you have had a chance to look at the paper that I suggested, and if you haven't, that's fine, you can look at it later on. The idea of the variation of modeling language variation is essentially based on trying to understand 4 different dimensions of language variation. And the first dimension is the user dimension. And the idea here is pretty simple. Our language changes based on who we are talking to. When we're talking to people who are very close to us, our friends, we use very casual language. We might perhaps use a lot of slang, terms of endearment. And our grammatical patterns, our intonation. Think of couples, they have this sweet way of talking with each other. And it's a phonology that they will only use with each other. They won't use it with anybody else. So it's just the couple that talk in a particular way. And when they use language with anybody else, then they shift their language to their phonology. So it's not something just that happens at the the level of formal grammar, but our phonology, our lexical choice. We create cute words when we're talking to our loved ones. When we're talking to children, we create these cute words. So essentially, our relationships and who we are talking to, how close they are, how distant they are, how much they share with us, how much they don't share with us, will change the way that we use language. So so that's an important dimension, and that's the first one that we want to look at. A second dimension is the mode. So whether we are speaking, whether we are writing, whether we are doing a bit of both, which is very common in today's world, whether we're using emoticons as well. You know, there's lots of different ways of creating and mixing modalities to create meaning. But let's say if we just want to look at speaking and writing for the sake of convenience here, so then we can think of how the language of or the grammar of speaking and the grammar of writing are different. And this is, again, leads to a very often problem in work on language descriptions and language acquisition, where people take the rules of written language and then they apply them to how people interact orally. You know, oral language and written language are different. They have their own grammars, and grammar, I mean, you know, models of explaining the ways or the patterns of language use, not rules of grammar. So speaking and writing have their own grammars, their own ways of use being employed by the people who use them, and therefore they can't be mixed and matched that easily in terms of how we expect people to learn the grammar of English and speak according to the grammar. Because actually, honestly speaking, if you talk to people around you, most people do not speak grammatically correct English, because when you talk about grammatically correct in terms of writing systems, it doesn't work. The way that we use oral language is a whole different system, and it's used very differently. And so those are two different ways. And of course, when you bring in multimodality, then you create even additional level of things that need to be considered. The third factor here is its use, which is that language varies based on whether we are engaged in everyday or specialized discourses. Now, this is very important for educational context, and I'll keep talking about this again and again in many different ways, because it's, when we're talking to people about the weather, about what we did, it's like I spent this afternoon with my sister and her family, and the kind of conversation that we had about kids, about the weather, about sports, about vacations, about people we know. It's a different language than when we talk about linguistics, when we talk about NNEST studies, when we talk about second language development studies. Those are specialized discourses, and our language changes. And again, it's not just that it changes in one level of language, that language changes across all its strata. And by strata, I mean all ways, I mean phonology, phonetics, lexical items of vocabulary, the lexicogrammar, the text structure, everything shifts. And this again, of course, if you're familiar with the work on ESP, this will sound very familiar, because ESP draws essentially on the use dimension in describing these different uses of language in different contexts. So, English for business, English for pilots, English for engineers, English for nurses. So you have all these ESPs, which are essentially focusing on the use dimension. So now as we move through these three things, you would probably start realizing that the user dimension is essentially something that is used often in terms of dialectal studies or language variation, in the sense of dialects and varieties. And use leads itself to work on ESP or LSP, language for specific purposes, and that kind of work. Uh, now, time is something that I've mentioned here, and it's definitely is part of the model that I've been working on, but it's not something that I'll talk about much today, and partly because time, when it comes to language and when it comes to semiosis, is an extremely complex phenomenon itself, and it's multi-tiered, and it's sort of another whole, um, I guess, another set of things that need to be considered. And so we'll leave it out for today, but at some point we will perhaps discuss it in another context. So when we take these three, so the first three of the four dimensions, that itself gives us a pretty complex model of language variation with a number of domains and subdomains. and allows us to make a huge range of observations that we can really think about in terms of our profession, in terms of what we do as language teachers, in terms of issues of native and non-native teachers. And those are the kind of issues that I would like us to sort of focus on today. So that's why I'm leaving time out. So the model, you might have seen this in the paper. Essentially, it's the 3 dimensions, not time included, which are plotted onto each other. I hope this airplane noise is not bothering you. Let me just close the window. This doesn't happen often, but of course it is today. Give me a second. Okay, sorry. I had the window open. I know, Marek, it's cold in in Poland, but here it's kind of warm. So anyway, I've closed the window. So the model comes from the paper, and so you've got the 3 dimensions, and you can see. I'm just trying to see if I have a pointer. Yes, I have a pointer. Okay. So you have the use dimension here, then you have the mode dimension and the user dimension. And so you can see that on the one hand, you have everyday discourses, you've got the specialized discourses, you have the on the user dimension, you have the local or the low social distance, or the global and the high social distance. And on the mode dimension, you have the written and the oral text. Now, as you know, as I think I've said this can be, of course, there's not one specialized discourse. There are many different kinds of specialized discourses, and each one of them may have its own grammar and will have to be studied. And people do study these things in an LSP and other contexts. But what we're trying to do here today, looking at this model, is combining all 3 of these domains. So when we combine these 3 domains, we can identify at least 8 different domains. And the way that I've listed them, I used to list them differently. So this is a newer way of listing them. And what I do is I look at the first thing that I list is the user, then the mode, and then the use. So the user is local, and so the domains 1 to 4 are all about local, and domains 5 to 8 are about global. So by local here, I mean low social distance. And again, this is a continuum in itself. It's not one local. So the way that you may talk to your closest siblings is not the way you talk perhaps to your parents, even though you're all in the same family. So there are levels of variations within the local as well. And then I put the second thing is the oral, and then the everyday. Now, the domains 1 and 2 are typically, if you want to think of examples of these, you can think of family members planning their vacation as being something that's local, oral, everyday. You can think of old friends exchanging emails with each other as something that's local or written, everyday sort of stuff. Now, these things are often studied in linguistics in areas of dialectology, world Englishes, and these are the disciplines that focus on variations that are based on essentially communities and relationships of people between communities, and how they interact, how they shift. Okay, again, of course, in social linguistics, also across time. Now, domains 3 and 4 are very interesting because we know they exist, but there's not a lot of research on them. And perhaps it's because I assume, I guess, my hypothesis here is that if we don't have a lot of studies of these, is because these domains of language are not very powerful. They don't lead to professional recognition or global sort of recognition. So it's not something that people study a lot, and that's not as visible as the local variation. So it's not as visible as domains 1 and 2. So they do exist. For example, domain 3, which is local, oral, and specialized, would be something where, for example, members of an Aboriginal community in Australia are talking about the local weather system in relation to how the crops grow, and farming, and that's getting pretty technical in their own context, but it's not something that we know much about, and we don't know what language and how they do these things. Perhaps they do exist, it's just perhaps that's something that I haven't seen yet. So it's a gap in my own knowledge as well. So something that I'm, looking out for. Similarly, there is probably local written specialized. So, for example, newsletters produced by rural community of farmers in rural Australia. I mean, these things exist, but have we studied them at the same level and with the same depth as we have studied other sets of language data? I'm not sure, and again, this is a gap in my knowledge at this point, and I would love to be corrected here to see how this is done. Perhaps it's done in anthropological linguistics or some other ways in which social linguistics is done, but I'm not very sure at the moment. Now, domains 5 and 6 are about global oral everyday and global written everyday. So here what you have similar is, of course, the global and everyday. What changes is the oral and the written and the mode. Now, it's interesting how the way that we study these shifts radically based on what if it's domain 5 or domain 6. I'm not saying that genre studies don't always look at global oral everyday. They do, but not as much. This is more sort of where the area of English as a lingua franca is sort of really working its way through, looking at conversations among people from different parts of the world, looking at how people use language orally in different contexts, in engaging with each other. It's something that's definitely developing, but it's in the context of ELF, but not, that's one area. People also, I guess, when people do conversation analysis, they also look at this. I didn't put conversation analysis here, but perhaps I should. Conversation analysis also sort of looks at this stuff here, which is domain 5. Domain 6 is where we have some genre studies, and essentially a lot of the traditional grammar actually sort of comes from here. So the global written everyday is where is the data that feeds into what become the traditional grammars that we use as pedagogical grammar, and kind of these are the grammars that we use in textbooks in our professional lives as models of language. But notice here now, this is very important. It's data coming from one domain. So when we talked earlier on about grammar being a theory of language, if grammar is a theory of language, but you're only getting data from one domain, then and then your theory of grammar is not able to predict language use and language occurrence in other domains. It's not rocket science to see why it happens. It happens because your grammars are restricted. Traditional grammars are restricted. They're collecting data from certain domains, and you cannot uh, generalize how based on that one domain on how language might be used in different domains or subdomains, and that's a limitation then of the traditional grammars. And this is, if we use these traditional grammars and pedagogical grammars as the benchmark for teachers, for teaching, and that's the only focus of teaching, then the question of course also rises, are we doing our students service by only teaching them these so-called pedagogical grammars when the students might need very specialized kinds of grammars in what they need to do. So there's much more that need to be considered here, and we'll talk about them as we look at these the observations that come out of these. Now, domain 7 and 8 are, again, they're similar because they're looking at global and specialized, the difference being oral and written. Now, when you look at domain 7, there's again some ELF work that I've seen where they've looked at oral interactions in university levels, at conferences, and so looks at ELF sort of stuff. A language for specific purposes does a bit of this. So, for example, air talk or sea talk for looking at air traffic controller language and things that's very specialized, it's global, and looking at conference presentations. So there's lots of stuff here that's done, but it's how often is it used in mainstream ESL? How often is it used in context of issues of discussing native and non-native? I'm not that sure, and again, that's something we need to perhaps expand and do more of. And then finally, we have the global written specialized things like academic papers, LSP, genre studies, that's what it sort of focuses on. So genre-based ways of literacy development, draw specifically on genres, academic genres, teaching people how to write research reports of various kinds, teaching people how to write dissertations, research papers, very specific sort of things. So those are the 8 domains that we can think of, we can sort of identify based on the 3 dimensions. Again, as I said, I haven't looked at time here at all, but we can. Now, these, what I want to go, having described this model, I want to share a set of observations with you. And these observations draw from the model. So if you can, I guess I'll have to flip back and forth between the model and the observations. But let me just remind you, if you can take a screenshot or something of the model, then it's probably a good idea if you can take a screenshot of this model, or if you can go to the link, follow the link that Marek has just posted. The model is there. And this list of domains is also included in this link that Marek has sent you. So if you keep the model and keep the domains available to you, so that when we look at the observations, we can make connections between them. So the first observation that I want to talk about is this one here. Oh, what's happening? Oh. Let me see if there's something funny going on. Okay, no, it's fine. All right. So yeah, the first one here is this one. So children typically begin to develop their mother tongues in domain 1 and 2 to some degrees, but not really. It's really domain 1. But they need to learn the language of domains 5 and 6 for wider communication, and domain 7 and 8 for higher education and professional work. Now, this particular observation applies not just to non-native speakers of English or any language. Actually, I should probably point out that the model, even though I'm going to exemplify through English, it's not designed necessarily for English. In fact, if you look at the model and you look at the notion of local everyday, we do a lot of code switching. And that explains the domain and the model explains why the translanguaging happens in these contexts. Right. So children then learn how to use language in domain 1, because that's where they engage with language. They engage with their caregivers, with their siblings, with their with their extended family, friends, and then they grow older and they meet other people. But essentially, the basic language, the first experiences of learning a language, happen with children in domain 1. Now, if we only speak the language of domain 1, then we are in trouble. And our language proficiency is very low because we cannot communicate with people who don't speak exactly the same way that we do. And of course, there's hardly anybody who speaks exactly the same way that you do, right? Even your closest friend, your sibling, even your twin will have variations in their language between you. So we need to know how to use language with others, right? We need to be able to engage with variation, with being able to negotiate differences and negotiate challenges and work through them. So we need to be able to go into 5 and 7 very quickly. I mean, 5 definitely, and then eventually 7 if we work in professional contexts. Now, as I said, this is true for everybody, not just non-native speakers. Native speakers can also perhaps be seen in terms of whether they have additional domains or are they strictly domain 1. So, think about this in terms of, for example, when we talk about it in context of English. So let's say, for example, in the US, people talk about Chicano English. A Chicano English is a dialect of English that is spoken by people who have Spanish as a heritage language, right? And they have a particular roots and the particular heritage, and reflects in their language. Now, if you only speak Chicano English and no other language, no other variety of English, then you will have a hard time communicating with people who speak other varieties of Englishes. You will have a hard time engaging with people who speak, standard English or in the context of education. You can think of it in terms not necessarily of ethnic dialects, but also think of it in terms of Anglo-American dialects, like Southern American English, which, the drawl and things. Again, it's fine. It's a dialect. It's a language variety that's used in certain contexts with certain people. But if you take it out of context and you try to use it in international context, then some people will have a hard time following you. Again, if you try to use that in academic context, you might not be able to, you might feel challenges. And we're not saying that certain dialects are bad or not bad. What we're trying to do with this model, in fact, is to show how all models how all variations have a place. And there are certain sets of variations that are very user oriented, and they're very personal to us because it reflects who we are. Our personal identities are sort of indexed in those variations. And so we see ourselves in these variations. But and other variations, on the other hand, are perhaps not as personal to us, but of course they're also very important to us in many ways, and they're signaled in different ways. So by looking at this model and the 8 domains, we can sort of start to see how language variation is global. It's not about native speakers only or non-native speakers only. It's about everybody, and it affects everybody in different ways. So a Southern American dialect a kid growing up in Southern American English will have to learn standard English used in educational contexts, and then language used in universities if they are going to succeed in engaging in higher education in professional sort of contexts. That's something that evolves over their lifetime. Again, development happens across time. Now, that's a way of looking at it. I think it's quite an important observation because it sort of explains to us how people from different parts of the world, speaking different dialects and different varieties, can have different trajectories in life if they are not familiarized with domains 5 and 6, and then later on domains 7 and 8. If you're only at 5 and 6, you still can't do 7 and 8. 7 and 8 is very highly technical, very specialized. This is where people have really hard time writing research papers, right? So, for example, I teach at the University of Sydney. We have an IELTS requirement of 7.0, so every student who comes in has a 7.0 in IELTS, and yet they struggle with writing research papers. And it's not because their language is poor. It's not. Their language is pretty good. But IELTS sort of looks at domains 5 and 6, whereas what we need them to be able to do in my program are domains 7 and 8, and that's what they're struggling with. And so we need to be, and I'll come back to this point, but as a professor of applied linguistics, my job actually, to a degree, is also teaching my students the language of applied linguistics. It's not just teaching them the matter, the content, but also teaching them the language of what they need to do. And this is something we'll come back to again. And so when we look at these things in global sort of a way, using this model, we start to realize some of the problems that we have, some of the problems that our students have, and ways to understand them. And therefore, by understanding them, we can think about ways of trying to resolve these problems. And that's essentially where we are trying to go, right? A solution of some of these problems. So the next observation that I have here is that non-mother tongue speakers of a language may start learning a language in any domain, depending on the context in which they learn. Now, this is a very interesting observation because for mother tongue speakers of a language, we all learn our language in domain 1, right? In a very local, with our friend, with our family, our parents, grandparents, siblings, uncles, aunts, other caregivers. That's where we start developing our language. But if he's learning another language as a non-mother tongue speaker of a language, it's possible that we will do it in the same context, so bilingual kids, like, I grew up speaking Urdu and English, and I learned both those languages in that context, in domain 1. But for many people, learning an additional language comes in at schooling. So it's not the same subdomain as learning your mother tongue. In other contexts, if you've got adult learners of a language, then you have a whole different context. Then you may have adult learners who are learning a language in specialized domains, and that's a whole different set of issues, right? So what we're sort of looking at here is looking at this model and saying, wow, it's like, okay, so the mother tongue speakers all start in domain 1, but non-mother tongue speakers can start at any point in time. And so that's a huge advantage, of course, but also it means that we need to think of their language and we think of language of people in different ways. We can't compare them in the same way. We can't judge them in the same way because they're really different languages. They have different grammars. They have different grammars because they use language in different contexts and they've learned it in different contexts. They need it to do it different things with it with different people, right? So again, talking about my students, international students who come into my program, fantastic. They all have 7.0. Their English is pretty good for domain 5 and 6 in general. But when it comes for them to go down to the pub and hang out with other Aussies, they have a really hard time. And it's not because their 5 or 6 is bad. The problem is that the Aussies who are hanging out at the beach are using domain 1, and right for them, their domain 1. And my international students do not share that domain 1 with these Aussies on and Bondi. And so there's this different language here. And again, unless you know how to negotiate those differences and be able to pick those up and develop your language in a certain way, you're going to be stuck. And if people who are on Bondi can't use domain 5, then again that's a problem if they can't negotiate those things. So the burden of communication here is not on either of the parties, but on both parties, because one speaks domain 5 from an international orientation, the other one speaks domain 1 from their local perspective. So there you go, and that leads to problems of communication of things. Now, if you judge a non-native speaker of a language based on the norms of domain 1, then it's inappropriate because that's not what they're supposed to do with it. Similarly, if you judge a mother tongue speaker of a language according to the norms of domain 7, they will not do much either, or even perhaps domain 5, where mother tongue speakers of a language are unable to communicate with other people who speak a different dialect or variety. And you see these in sort of play in media all the time, in news reports and anecdotes, and also in social linguistics studies of looking at interactions between people from different backgrounds. So that's a second observation. So going down to the third observation. Now, if you have questions, I've been sort of following the chat as well. If you have questions or something, just let me know. You can flag or you can just post your question in this thing, or you can post the question. Now, as I said, I guess I've already predicted this. So one difference between native and non-native speakers, as well as across different native and non-native speakers, is in the language of their domains 1 and perhaps 2. That is the variety of language that they grew up with. So if if we want to differentiate between different dialect speakers, different communities, then we're really looking at people who have different differences in their domain 1, and those differences in domain 1 tell us where those how they differ. Right. So I've sort of predicted this, so I'll move on because there are other things that I want to spend more time on. Okay. Now, this is important. Differences between domain 5 to 8. I'll come back to that question, Miajan. Good question. It's not. Let me actually answer this question. I'm just going to pause my slide here. So when we look at the model, Miajan, it's not about native or non-native. I'm using those labels for convenience here because we're sort of familiar with those terms. But essentially, for generation 1.5 or any group of people, domain 1 is always domain 1. If it's the domain where they start developing their language. If they've got a mixing of Korean and English there, or they've got a mixing of Japanese and Korean there, or Urdu and Pashto there, it doesn't really matter what those combinations are or what those, the spectrum of those variations are, because that's their domain 1. So everybody's domain 1 is their domain 1. There's no questioning it, right? And that's why the traditional grammars are not looking at those for models. They're looking at domain 5. And whereas dialectologists, people who are interested in a particular generation or a particular community, focus on the variations of that community. and as opposed to other communities, right? So their domain is they're the native speakers of their own domain, and that's true for everyone essentially, right? I hope I answered your question, but if not, I'll be happy to expand more later on. So uh, the next observation I had was differences between domains 5 and 8. Now, and their subdomains, because as I said, it's not domain 5 is not single. It's got huge number of subdomains itself. And there's, where I can even start sort of separating them out here at the moment. But the key thing here is that the differences of domain 5 and 8 are not based on the users, but on the uses and mode, right? Remember, the user is a constant, is always global, high social distance, right? We're dealing with language that is designed and developed and has evolved to be used by people who do not know each other really well, right? So it's for a globally oriented communication. It's to be used with people you don't know really well, who don't belong to your community, and therefore you don't want to use your own dialect, but you want to use a more what is perhaps called a standard language, because you want to communicate with people and be able to achieve the goals that you have. Now, in this case, your linguistic heritage is not important. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if you are a mother tongue speaker or a non-mother tongue speaker, or if you're a native speaker or a non-native speaker, makes no difference. It's the same game for everyone. Now, this is shifting it from domain 1, right? So if I go to Bondi and I want to hang out with a bunch of Aussies on the beach, and that's the local domain, they have there's strong local networks, they know each other really well, they have low social distance, and I'm coming in as an outsider, and I want to interact with them and communicate with them to a degree. I need to be able to compensate and negotiate my way into interacting with them, and by doing that, their language will change as well. It won't remain the same. They will have to negotiate with me as well. So that's in the context of domain 1. But in the context of domain 5, nobody knows each other. We're all strangers. We're all new, and we're all trying to interact and communicate, and therefore we all have a shared interest in making this happen. And therefore, our patterns of language use are quite variable in that sense. Of course, we develop norms as we interact, and those norms evolve in that interaction. And that's what I was saying, that people who are doing casual work on conversation analysis, people who are doing work on else, English is a lingua franca, are sort of trying to study these encounters and trying to understand how this happens and how people are able to build ways of communicating effectively, even though their own individual domain ones are quite different from each other, right? So, but we are able to do that, and that's where we look at things. Now, the key thing here is the use when we look at, especially when we look at domain 7 and 8. It is the use that creates the norms, okay, of language. So when we are looking at domain 7 and 8, when we're looking at domain 8, for example, written language in specialized contexts. So, for example, think of law. The language of law is highly specialized, highly technicalized, and you and I can't understand it necessarily unless we have some training in law. And it's not about who, the people who create this law, this language of law, or people who practice law. People who create this language are the people who are participants of this community of people who are working in this particular professional context. You can think of it in the same way as linguistics or applied linguistics, or for example, even TESOL. I like to give this example of TESOL to people who work in our discipline by, for example, thinking of TESOL quarterly. If you look up, if you look at the journal TESOL quarterly and you look at the early issues published in, this is the 50th year anniversary. So if you look back in the mid 1960s, the language of TESOL quarterly is hugely different from what you see today. You don't see those sort of, the way that we have our research papers framed, the way that we will structure them. You don't see those things. They don't exist. So somewhere along the line, those norms developed. They didn't exist because monolingual speakers of English use them always. No, it's a community of users creating language for a particular purpose in a particular context in writing. that where these norms developed. Now, as the community changed, these norms changed too, right? So perhaps when sort of in the 60s there was a very high number of native speakers or Anglo native speakers who were doing applied linguistics and publishing in this area for various political historical reasons. That has shifted, right? So in 90s, in the 2000s, and the 2000 and the teens now, things have changed. You know, TESOL membership, if you look at the TESOL quarterly and you look at who's publishing, you will see people are publishing from all over the world. In fact, as I think I've said this with, when Brian and I put in a bid to become editors of TESOL quarterly, one of our key agendas was internationalization. And internationalization is about bringing in voices from different parts of the world. Now, in doing this, what we are also very careful about is it doesn't mean that anybody can write and contribute. We still have a disciplinary norm. We have a language of TESOL quarterly that has evolved because over time, the norms have been developed by people who are publishing in the journal, not by us, not by some native speaker, not by some body, but rather by the people who have been publishing in TESOL quarterly, right? Those are the people who create the language of TESOL quarterly. Of course, it's partly moderated and edited. Yes, that's true, but it's still their voice, right? And that's what creates the language of domain 7 and domain 8. It's not mother tongue speakers of it, but it's the people who work in that community, in that group, the community of practice, if you want to use that term, right? So there's linkages that I'm trying to draw here as well. So that's how we move into domain 7 and 8. And when we move into these domains, essentially the idea of native speaker teacher, non-native speaker teacher is irrelevant, because the norms of this language are not about native, non-native. That's really essentially the criteria of native, non-native. If you really want to keep it, it's only if you deal with that domain 1 only. If education was only about teaching people the language of domain 1, yes, then perhaps we could make an argument that yes, native speakers are useful because they understand it and you're learning it. Therefore, it's like me going to the beach in Bondi. If I want to learn the language of these surfers, then I need to learn it from them, and they are the native speakers of that dialect of surfer English on Bondi, and I will learn from them. But how often is that the case, right? In education context, that's hardly ever the case. Is we're learning language to interact with globally with other people from around the world. That's essentially why English is a global language. It's because we want to use language with people from around the world. And in that context, nativeness has no value at all. It's essentially being able to understand how language works in a particular domain that is important. Right, so that's another observation that comes out of this model, and it sort of helps it up. So I mean, I know that this particular observation, perhaps many of us have talked about it in different contexts, in different ways. What the model does, it gives us a theoretical rationale and a theoretical reasoning for why things happen in a way that it does. Mirjan, very good question. Culture is also a large part of language use. No. Yes, of course it is. But again, the culture shifts, right? There's no single culture. It's like language. I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on culture, but actually, when we talk about culture and cross-cultural communication or intercultural communication, we know that culture itself is not something that is concrete or fixed, even for a single individual. People often talk about the iceberg model as an explanation of culture. So what we traditionally define as visible ways of culture are actually just the tip of the iceberg. Everything that builds that culture is actually invisible to most of us, and it includes a number of different things. So yes, culture and language are very closely related. And in fact, culture evolves through language, and language is embedded in culture. So it's, of course, a very very, very close relationship, but it's not as if culture exists as a single entity. It itself is very fluid, and its fluidity merges with the fluidity of language to create the mosaic that we are part of. So yes, culture is part of language, but it's like culture is not it's static either. It's dynamic in almost every way every way that language is dynamic in. And again, partly because culture allows you to give us is in a way a semiotic system. It gives you certain meanings in different ways. Culture falls in every single domain, right? So, and it shifts across domains. So if language and culture are intrinsically bound, then the culture shifts and it's negotiated also as language shifts and is negotiated. So, uh, ways of doing things can change, ways of believing in certain things, practices change, and as they change, the language changes, and as the language changes, some of those practices are seen as being different. And so, of course, that's why this desire to normalize things, to codify things, but then if that codification doesn't always work, as we were talking about, then the problem is how we're trying to codify things and how we're trying to create rules rather than how people actually practice things. Uh, so very good question, and I think we can have a whole different session on this, on culture and language. It's a a fascinating area. But let's move on, and we'll see if we'll have time to come back to it again. But just to recap, language, culture go together really. It's everywhere, and just like language is not static, culture is not static either. It's fluid and dynamic. Um, so the next observation is that proficiency in one domain or subdomain of language does not imply proficiency in another. Now, this is very important and something that we need to keep in mind, especially in the context of teaching and education. Simply because you have proficiency in domain one doesn't mean you have a proficiency in domain two. People who can speak it doesn't mean they can write. If people who can write doesn't mean they can't speak. So, for example, I can read French. I can't, but that's it. I can't write it, and I cannot speak it or understand it, but I can read it. So my proficiency is French is very limited in a certain domain and a subdomain, and I can only read French of a certain kind. I can only read fiction, right? And that's and also a certain kind of fiction, and that's because I was trained into doing that, and nothing else. So again, that's just an example of how proficiency shifts and it's constantly changing, and that it's not an indicator. And what it means here, for in the context of NEST and NNEST, is simply because somebody has a proficiency in one domain, let's say domain 1 and domain 2, does not mean that they will have proficiency in domain 7 and 8. And we cannot therefore also predict that they will be able to teach any of it. I know even for domain 1, you can't predict that they can teach it unless you have professional training, some understanding of teaching and learning. But to try to think of a different domain, it just totally falls up altogether. And this is something that we'll come back to again in a bit, but I just wanted to lay this out. Now, I also have a reference here to my DELP paper with Lydia Dutcher. I'm not sure if this link works for you guys, but if it does, do click on it. And DELP is I won't have time to talk about DELP at all, but it stands for Dynamic Approach to Language Proficiency. It's a way in which Lydia and I have been trying to think about what are some alternative ways of trying to understand language proficiency, and that's essentially what it looks at. So we'll talk about that later on, perhaps another session. So moving on then. Now, when we think about language proficiency needs of teachers, now this is talking more about native or NNESTs and NNESTs. We need to consider the domain of language variation that they teach and teach in. Now, notice I'm not saying language proficiency of language teachers. And I've done this on purpose. Okay? So it's not proficiency of language teachers, it's proficiency needs of teachers. And the reason I say it, and I'll talk about this later on again, is that everybody is a teacher. Everybody has to teach. Sorry, yes, Marek. Yes, Marek.
Ahmar? Sorry to interrupt, but we're already sort of 7 minutes over time. We're supposed to finish up. So if you can maybe sort of wrap it up in a couple of minutes.
All right, sounds good. So you said 12 minutes or 2 minutes?
if you maybe in
All
2-3
right.
minutes,
Yep,
if
absolutely.
you can sort of close the session,
Okay.
because we're already
Sorry.
7 minutes.
I just get no. That's all right. I just get carried away. Okay. This is fascinating work, and the observations that I've listed here, are not observations that I haven't published on all of these observations yet. These are things that I'm still thinking about. So let me just read them quickly. So, so here, what I'm talking briefly about is that we need to think about language proficiency of all teachers, not just language teachers, because all teachers are in some way or the other language teachers, and they need to have some understanding. Given the inalienable relationship between language and the meaning that it creates, language proficiency correlates with perceptions of knowledge. Now, this needs a lot of unpacking, and it's probably quite something that can generate quite a bit of debate. But what I'm in a nutshell trying to get at is that what language we speak gives us a certain set of knowledge, and certain sets of our worldview is shaped by that language, and people's perceptions of our worldviews and our language and who we are shaped by it as well. So it's very important to consider this. Next is, if education is designed to help students work across borders and be able to learn about new things, then we need our students to move from language of their home, that's domain 1 and 2, and develop the language of domains 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. This particular observation actually I've talked about quite a bit already, so that's fine. Now, an awareness of language variation across the 8 domains and subdomains can help teachers understand what language a student brings to the class and what language they need to develop in order to succeed in their target environment. A lot of unpacking here to do, but I think this should be what we've talked about so far should help us move into this direction. Because language across domains and subdomains varies, a language teacher cannot teach all these variations, right? So a language teacher cannot teach everything that one needs to know about language. So don't blame language teachers, which sometimes happens in schools and in other places. And responsibility to help the students develop appropriate linguistic abilities lies with all teachers, including subject specialists. Success in teaching is not achieved by, and now this is the last observation that I have, and perhaps just to recap some things, that success in teaching is not achieved by dissing the language of domains 1 and 2. So it's not saying that what people bring with them is bad or not good or limited, whether it's it's language X or Y or Z or a mixture of those languages, it doesn't really matter. It is more helpful to recognize where the student's coming from, what language they bring with them, to recognize it, and then to help them achieve what they need to do in order to use language in other contexts with other people in other ways to achieve even more in terms of their language abilities. So it is more helpful to recognize what the students are able to achieve through the language that they already have, and then showing them additional ways of using language and explaining how these variations relate to various contexts and what meanings they enable us to make. So essentially, I'm talking about is empowerment, taking what they have, moving them along, but recognizing where they're coming from, recognizing their dialectal variations, whether it's is a Chicano English, whether it's Black English, whether it's Southern English, whether it's New York English, whether it's Korean English, whether it's Pakistani English, Haitian English, it doesn't matter. We all have our ways of doing things, our own domains, language of domain 1 and 2. We may not speak any English at all. We might start learning English at domain 5, in which case our domain 1 is Korean or Chinese or Urdu. We need to recognize those, and we need to think of ways of incorporating those domains, language of domains 1 and 2 into teaching language of domain 5 and 6, and then later on domain 7 and 8. So yeah, that's where I should stop, I think. Thank you again. I'm sorry I took longer, but I just got carried away. Thanks, Marek.
No, thanks, Ahmar. It was very interesting, and I wish I didn't have to cut the webinar short, but the recording will be available online on TEFL Equity Advocates YouTube channel. I can actually post a link to the channel here as well. And so thanks, Ahmar, for this fascinating webinar. And I also wanted to thank BELTA, the Belgian English Language Teaching Association, and James Taylor for making this series of webinars possible. So if you're ever in Belgium or around, do go to their conference. They've got a great event in April coming up as well. I've been there once, and it's a great conference as well. So if you're in Belgium, definitely recommend it. And yeah, thanks, Ahmar. If you still have any sort of quick questions, please type them in the chat box, and maybe we can answer them very quickly. Yeah, and here's the link, the YouTube channel. So do follow TEFL Equity Advocates on YouTube. You can watch all the previous webinars as well there, and this webinar will be posted there soon.
Fantastic. Thanks, Marek. And if people have questions, of course, they can welcome to email me. I'll be happy to respond.
Okay. So if you don't have any more questions, I might say goodbye.
See you guys.
See you later. Yeah. See everyone. Hope to meet you again, Ahmad,
Yep.
soon at the conference. And